Hello, my name is Mikay Parsons, and I am a current graduate master's student at San Diego State University in the Communication Studies Department. And today I'll be telling you about some research that I had the opportunity to do last year after competing in collegiate debate for 4 years of my undergraduate career, and now coaching at San Diego State University, their NPDA Parley team. So this research really comes from my interest in debate as an activity and also my existence as a trans person within the activity and sort of what that was like, what survival looks like for people experiencing hardships in communities that they really care about. I think that that is a really interesting place of contention. And I'm really excited with the research that I've done and the research that I hopefully get to do about this topic in the future. So let's get started. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is why we're here in the first place. The first place that I would like to start is an explanation of a little bit about myself, and then also we'll get into some statistics about transphobia in education in general, but then also in debate. So why am I here to start off? I'm here because being trans in higher education is incredibly precarious. I think that existing in a group that is both oppressed and also far and few between in higher education is incredibly difficult. I think being one of the few in every department or one of the only in every department in any category is extraordinarily difficult. And I think having the experience of being trans in the debate community where there are very few trans people and in higher education where there are very few trans people has really opened my eyes to what survival really looks like and means and how it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort. And that energy and effort that's being put forward is, often coded as resiliency and it's marketed as a strength, which I think is valid. I think being positive is important, but I also think it's really important to understand and remember why that resiliency is required in the first place. And I think that that's really where my future research interests lie is in what would it look like for trans people to not have to be resilient in spaces of higher education or for Black students to not have to be resilient in the face of, racist professors and institutions. And so this is sort of a stepping stone to get me to that point where I can do more research about cis people and transphobia in higher education, and that the thing that necessitates resiliency in the first place. So that's where my interest comes from. Also, participating in debate is really interesting and unique, and we'll talk about debate in a couple slides. But yeah, as a prelude. So transphobia in education. I think that this is a really important place to start to sort of remind us of where we've been and where we need to go. So this first statistic that 79% of trans students reported feeling unsafe at school comes from the UK, actually from UNESCO. And they did a study that looked at all levels of education in the United Kingdom and found that, yes, 79% of trans students perceived a lack of safety in school, which is an alarming statistic, and I think really grounds us in why this conversation needs to be happening all of the time, everywhere in spaces of higher education. This 26% statistic, that 26% of trans students reported verbal or physical harassment, comes from the United States Transgender Survey, and this is specifically of trans students in higher education, which means that not only is there perceived lack of safety amongst trans students in general, but also in higher education, there is actual verbal physical harassment happening to at least a quarter of trans students, which is astronomically high and very indicative of a larger system of sexism and transphobia in education at large. So to start having a conversation about what people do to survive, I think we first need to understand why this violence exists. And that's sort of where I go with this theoretical framework. So I really began my inquiry in a space that feels like home to me, which is critical theory and phenomenology. specifically queer phenomenology from Sarah Ahmed. I have read that book a million times, talked about it in a ton of different papers. I think it is a really good way to start talking about bracketing and how violence is necessarily ignored unless you're subjected to that violence, and how that ignoring of violence is the thing that allows it to be in the place in the first place. So I, however, started with theory of performativity and an understanding of gender from the explanation that Butler gives in Bodies That Matter. She specifically expands upon other theories about gender and its social existence, like from Foucault and Simone de Beauvoir and other queer theorists of the late 20th century, to sort of challenge these hegemonic views of gender and sex as being the same, as inseparable, as natural. So this camp of critical literature produced the argument that I subscribe to, that one is not born a particular gender, but rather becomes that gender through experience and negotiation with social norms, socialization, etc., throughout your life. So this means that, very importantly, gender and sex are not natural categories, but rather created, constituted through regulatory norms that get produced over time, get reinforced, that produce particular genders. So rather than arguing, though, that discourse causes sexual difference, it's not like, we just talk about these things and then they come into being. Rather, Butler uses a Foucauldian understanding of sex as a regulatory ideal. So sex produces, it demarcates, and it differentiates the bodies that it controls. So sex is, again, a construct just in the same way that gender is, that as a regulatory practice produces particular bodies that it then controls. So Butler specifically argues that this production of sex comes about through a reiteration of these norms, but this reiteration has to be forcible. So the way that I think about forcible reiterations is I think about what happens when you do this iteration of gender like incorrectly, right? So I think intersex babies are a good place to go to think about this in a very material sense, where genital mutilation surgery is a norm in a lot of hospitals. When babies are born with genitalia, they do not directly align either with what a normative construction of a vagina is or what a normative construction of a penis is. And so this is a literal act of punishment for a body being born outside of these particular categories of sex that really reifies what sex is, right? So when we punish people for falling outside of those categories, we reinscribe and reproduce the categories in and of themselves. So that's my general understanding and framework through which I understand gender and sex. And I think that does a really cool thing where we sort of figure out that these categories are not natural. And I think that is such an empowering moment of realization, especially when we think about how they are created in the first place. And when we understand how those things are created in the first place, perhaps there are possibilities for disruption by using those norms and the reification process. So my sort of argument, an argument that is very popular, especially in critical theory, is that there are opportunities for rematerialization where we can re-articulate and call into question sort of the regulatory laws, the punishments that happen, and sort of expose and think about what these possibilities could look like for, in this case, for this paper specifically, what these possibilities look like for survival. In other cases, it could be to challenge sort of hegemonic views and norms of sex and gender as natural and mutable, right? This paper specifically, I'm interested in how these sort of third spaces, possibilities for rematerialization, provide spaces of survival and avenues of survival for people enduring violence in a system that they must exist in, right? So in this case, in debate, and then in general, I'm interested in higher education at large. So sort of moving on from there, I started thinking about debate. And so that sort of theoretical framework piece is many years in the making. I've worked through many complicated books. I think critical theory is challenging for most people, and that has taken a lot of time and reflecting to get to a place where that is sort of my framing of gender and sex. And during this time, I've also, that I was thinking about these things in critical theory and in classes and in papers, in conversations. I was also participating and coaching in debate in college and a little bit in high school as well. And I think debate is really unique and has a lot of revolutionary potential for a couple of reasons. I think the first is sort of the format of debate. So, first and foremost, debate is an activity where you have to listen to the other side in order to win. So, if I get up and I sort of engage and challenge and tell a story that is really important to me, the other team has to listen to what I am saying in order to adequately respond and explain how they have won the round in spite of the speech that I have given. This means that active engagement is necessary, right? Not listening for the sake of listening, but rather listening for the sake of responding, which requires you to at least process a lot of what is being said in order to engage strategically and answer in the most strategic way possible. You really have to understand the breadth of the argument being made in order to engage it on a reasoning level, on a warranted level, in order to refute it. The other interesting thing about debate, which I think can definitely be a double-edged sword, is that scholarships and access to higher education are incredible things that debate gives us, but it also means that I went to school on a debate scholarship and relied on that scholarship in order to pay for college. And so I've sort of at times felt stuck, right? If you are relying upon this activity that you experience violence within in order to pay for your college, there's not a lot of options other than perhaps dropping out of college or taking on an extra $6,000 or whatever in private student loans or federal student loans even. I mean, that can really put you in a negative space. Or it could force you out of college altogether, which is not ideal. And so the scholarship question, this access to higher education question, is definitely an interesting conversation to have, and a reason why we sort of have an obligation to make debate the best it can be for people that need it in order to access higher education. The history of resistance within debate, I think, is absolutely fascinating. I talk about this a little bit in the paper. I think a lot of people have explored this. I read a lot of accounts of this, which has been incredibly insightful. Debate as an activity is incredibly inundated with all of the ideological, failures and et cetera of the world around us. And I think we like to pretend that debate is this sort of unique space, but it's not. In fact, the history of resistance and debate is one that is rooted absolutely in anti-Black violence and sort of white supremacist notions and ideals of what a debate should look like, or what, professionalism, I think, is a good way to sort of ground that idea if you don't have a lot of experience with debate. And so resistance has sort of mirrored that, right? So it's definitely been tied back to Black policy debaters disrupting normative styles of debate to bring light to more pressing issues about the world and about debate itself. Unfortunately, this style of debate was heavily resisted, right? So performance style debate definitely shifted conversations within college policy and led to retaliation. So it led to a bifurcation of the format itself. It sort of split. And this is a phenomenon we call white flight, which obviously is very popular in a lot of different fields, and it applies to debate in that debate sort of activities get split and split and split and split, where we have, I couldn't even count the number of formats of debate we have now. And a lot of the splits that are happening are in response to performance style debate and non-topical debate is what we call it. And this is sort of the debate where a lot of marginalized communities, specifically, like I said, Black debaters in the college policy community, found survival mechanisms is one way that it's been talked about, or an ability to talk about the world around us and not just the resolution, not just the formal debate proposition that we were intended to talk about. And so there are lots of stories and lots of histories of the ways that retaliation has happened. And it sort of isn't surprising that challenges to a system have led to retaliation. But I think that that retaliation says a lot about the system in and of itself, and sort of explains why the resistance was effective, right? I think the resistance had a reaction that led to a lot of teams doubling down in very racist ways. And then now we know that those teams doubled down in very racist ways. It's a historical record now. It's talked about. It's sort of lore within the community, and I think that that provides a level of accountability, which is really cool. But also, debate is not a space free of racism yet, which means that there's still a lot of work to be done. But as a survival mechanism, I think performance style debate is really incredible and something that I ended up emulating myself in my own debate career, and I'm really grateful to that. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about with this presentation, is what that looked like and how it can be incredibly empowering. Even though I have a lot of qualms with the word empowering, I think if you have to be in an activity, doing it in a way that allows you to have conversations that you need to have in order to participate safely is really important, and I think says a lot, which is why I decided to research it. The final thing that I sort of wanted to talk about on this slide is this idea of contradiction. So this is what I think motivated me to focus specifically on trans debaters, because within debate, you know, we do have these back and forth conversations a lot of the times about what debate looks like, and who it's harming and who it's propagating. And unfortunately, a lot of those conversations, as you might have guessed, are incredibly white, and they are incredibly cis, and they're incredibly straight. And in fact, a former LD debater named Sophie Blake wrote a piece that I read and sort of used in my analysis for this research specifically, talking about how when sexism is resisted in debate, right? So when we take like analyses of speaker points, and we show that cis women overwhelmingly get fewer speaker points than cis men, or we talk about, you know, cis men being really aggressive in round and how that can be intimidating and can be like sort of a fear tactic in order to win. These conversations are definitely harmful in as far as they exclude and prevent conversation about the sort of transphobic underlying assumptions of them, the cisnormativity of them, and are just exclusionary in as far as they don't mention the specific harms that trans debaters feel. And so Sophie Blake wrote this piece and talked about a lot of the analyses that were being made at the time. I can't remember exactly when this was published, but this was a lot about speaker points. It was a lot about the ways in which cis men would participate in debate rounds. And she makes the argument that this at best ignores and erases harm felt by trans people, and at worst categorizes trans and or intersex folks as their sex assigned at birth. And that's from a lot of the ways that the analyses happened. So a lot of people were going back through old data from different debate tournaments and then guessing based on people's names, and some other like very vague categories that you could find from their student accounts online, and categorizing them as men or women that way, which, you know, as a practice, as a research practice, I think there's a conversation to be had about that. But specifically when we're talking about violence that is happening in debate rounds, and we're focusing on sort of ideological norms and hegemonic power structures, and then also in those analyses engaging in very similar practices that cause similar types of harm to marginalized communities, I think that that is something that needs to be questioned. And I very much agree with Sophie Blake about this. And I think that this is sort of what motivated me to think about, you know, when conversations are happening in spaces that are talking about equality and justice and equity, that they themselves, the conversations themselves, are exclusionary and are harmful. over and over and over again, what do trans people do? I mean, if on one side you have, very blatant, explicit transphobia, cissexism, so you can't talk to these people. And then you have the people that do care about equity, they do care about justice, but then they are themselves are engaging in transphobic assumptions and at worst, like purposefully misgendering, purposefully um, putting non-binary and binary trans people into categories that they do not belong in. That is violent. If you have these two camps, sort of, we're stuck in the middle again of a lack of space and a lack of support that necessitates some serious compartmentalization and I hate to say it, but resiliency. And that's what I'm really interested in, both in how I did this and how other people in debate have done it. So this leads me to my research questions, which are, what drives people to knowingly or unknowingly exhibit transphobic modes of thought? Why are trans debaters, judges, and coaches compelled and motivated to stay in the debate world as it currently exists? And finally, what do trans debaters specifically do to survive the active harm and violence they experience in and out of round? So the first place that I sort of went in thinking about this research is the idea of utopian communication. So Federico Boni defines communication as a mutual deliberation of meaning. And when these societal messages are latent with transphobia and cissexism, we have to interrupt that flow of information and communication with counter narratives in order to drown out this sort of one-sided deliberation that is transphobic and cissexist. And so in debate, this is sort of why I think a lot of narratives are used by debaters in order to disrupt these sort of common modes of thought, because when they're not disrupted, they are perpetuated, they're naturalized, right? So inserting narratives into a debate round, talking about transphobia in every single round means that other people have to attend to the ways that they are talking about gender and sex and sexuality. They also have to attend to sort of the stories that are being told by the people experiencing the violence that are being talked about. So this means that we take these particular representations and structures of the world that are normally taken as natural, right? We normally see gender is natural, sex is natural. And we say, no, we disrupt that flow of information every single round, which is, again, why I think that a lot of people use narrative in rounds in order to disrupt these dominant hegemonic norms and ideologies. The other way that I think it is interesting to talk about debate and resistance, and sort of the way that I engaged in debate as a trans person, is that of argument as resistance. So by and large, narratives have to do with personal experience. So very similar to utopian communication, where you tell your story over and over and over again, because again, it cannot be bracketed out. And debate specifically means that the other team has to engage with the story that you are telling, with the experience that you are detailing, in order to win the round. I think that that's incredibly powerful. It forces conversations, and it means that you get to tell your story and get to tell people when they're wrong about their responses to your story. And I think that was an incredible moment of realization for me of what resistance can really look like, especially on an interpersonal level. When we often think about resistance, we think of structural resistance. I think interpersonal resistance is just as important and often forgotten. The second sort of pieces of argument as resistance and debate writ large is the existence of a judge. And I think having a judge means that we are asking somebody, especially when we're telling a story, to evaluate and attend to and think through the arguments that you're forwarding, and what that sort of means for the round, but then also what that means for the tournament, and then what that means for teams, and then what that means for the debate community at large. And I think that that active engagement from both judges, who are often coaches, and other teams means that you get to circulate your arguments a lot faster. The judge will go back and talk to their team about the arguments that they heard. And that sort of just propagates conversations that otherwise would not be happening because of the ways that cissexism and transphobia are taken as natural and immovable. The final piece is that of competition, which I've already definitely talked about. So people have to engage in a really substantial way in order to win the round, which I think, forces a lot of engagement that otherwise would not happen. And this is why I think debate definitely has a very incredible revolutionary potential, and why I'm excited to see where it goes in the future. So in the future, I think for myself, taking this research that I've done and the conversations that I've had with other trans people in debate means that I am going to continue researching transphobia in higher education. But I think that this really taught me that this isn't something that studying trans people will solve. I think studying trans people is studying the wrong side of the problem. I think studying cis people and why cis people engage in behaviors in the ways that they do would shed a lot more light on why transphobia exists, which it feels silly that it took a whole paper for me to realize this, but it's definitely true. I think trans people are doing what they can, like most marginalized people, in all marginalized people, in instances of and spaces rather where violence happens regularly. I mean, rhetorical violence happens almost every day in classes that I'm in, and I see it happening all the time and experience it. And survival is incredibly important, especially as change is happening. But I think what's even more important is to make that change happen. And so that's where I think that this research should go. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your NCA.